Picture this. You're inside a steel box. 33 tons of American engineering wrapped around you. Should feel safe, right? Now picture a teenager, 16 years old, 2 hours of training, holding a tube that costs less than a pair of boots. And that tube can punch through 200 millimeters of armor. Your frontal plate is 75. Do the math. That kid can kill you and your entire crew with a weapon that costs $40. Every window in every village is a firing position. Every hedgerow might hide someone with that tube. And your steel box, your protection, just made sure everyone within a mile knows exactly where you are. That's the math that defined tank warfare by 1944. That's what the movies never show you. You've seen the movies. Tanks rolling across Europe, steel fortresses grinding toward Berlin, armor absorbing hits, crews buttoned up safe inside, protected by tons of steel from the chaos outside. You think you understand tank warfare. You don't. Not even close. Let me tell you what soldiers actually knew. What the men who climbed into those vehicles understood before their first day in combat. The steel didn't protect them. It announced them. It made them the biggest, loudest, most visible target on the battlefield, surrounded by weapons specifically designed to punch through that steel and kill everyone inside. The myth is that armor meant safety. The truth is that armor meant target. Here's the math nobody shows you in the movies. The M10 tank destroyer, the vehicle that would become the platform for one of the war's most famous last stands, had armor that ranged from 19 millimeters on the sides to 57 millimeters at its thickest point on the gun mantlet. 19 millimeters. That's about 3/4 of an inch. Heavy machine gun fire at close range could penetrate that. Now consider what the Germans were shooting back with. The standard Pak-40 anti-tank gun, and Germany built over 23,000 of them during the war, could penetrate 106 millimeters of steel at 500 yards. The M10's thickest armor was 57 millimeters. The Tiger tank's 88 millimeters gun could penetrate 138 millimeters at 100 meters and remained lethal well beyond 2,000 meters, ranges where most tank crews couldn't even identify what was killing them. Do the math. There was no range at which the M10's armor could stop the weapons arrayed against it. Not at 500 yards, not at 1,000, not anywhere. Math doesn't negotiate. But here's the part that really breaks the comfortable myth. The M10's turret had no roof, 0 millimeters of overhead protection. 3 of the 5 crew members, the commander, gunner, and loader, worked standing up in that turret exposed to the sky, exposed to mortars, exposed to artillery, exposed to grenades dropped from windows as they passed through towns. This wasn't a manufacturing shortcut. It wasn't someone forgetting to finish the vehicle. It was intentional doctrine. The men who designed the M10 decided, on purpose, that overhead armor was unnecessary weight. They figured visibility and the ability to bail out quickly were more important than protection. Think about that. They designed in the ability to bail out quickly because they assumed you'd need to. Soviet weapons testers got their hands on an M10 at the Kubinka Proving Grounds in 1943. Their assessment was blunt. The open turret would result in loss of the crew on the battlefield to mortars, shells, bombs, machine gun fire from aircraft, grenades, and bottles with incendiary fluid. They were right. And everyone knew they were right. And the vehicles went into combat anyway. The turret had another problem that the movies never show you. It was entirely hand-cranked. No powered traverse, just a wheel and gears and human muscle. A full 360-degree rotation took approximately 80 seconds. 80 seconds. In tank combat, the difference between life and death was measured in single seconds. If an enemy appeared on your flank, you had about a minute and a half to get your gun pointed at him. The 3-inch gun barrel was so nose-heavy that engineers bolted 2,500 pounds of counterweight to the turret rear just to allow rotation at all. Even with that, on slopes greater than 4 degrees, the turret couldn't traverse. You're in a vehicle designed to fight tanks parked on a slight incline, and you can't turn your gun. That's not protection, that's a death sentence with a crank handle. You want to know what the crews called their vehicles? They called them coffins. They called them death traps. The M10 earned the nickname Purple Heart Box. That's soldier humor. You laugh because the alternative is screaming. But it's also accurate description. The men who climbed into those vehicles knew exactly what they were climbing into. And here's the uncomfortable truth that connects all of this. Armor didn't just fail to protect the men inside. It actively endangered them. German anti-tank doctrine specifically organized around destroying tanks first. Concealed guns with uninterrupted fields of fire waited specifically for armored vehicles. Being inside armor made you the #1 priority target on every battlefield. Infantry sometimes didn't want tanks near their positions, not because tanks weren't useful, but because tanks drew fire, artillery, anti-tank guns, Panzerfaust teams. Every German soldier knew where the tanks were because tanks were the loudest, most visible things for miles. The vehicle meant to protect you made sure everyone knew exactly where to aim. Picture this. You're inside a steel box. The enemy has weapons that punch through steel boxes like paper. And every German soldier on the battlefield, every one of them, knows exactly where you are because you're the loudest, most visible thing in sight. Your engine noise carries for hundreds of yards. Your treads leave tracks a blind man could follow. Your silhouette stands out against any terrain. Still feel protected? The movies show tanks absorbing hits, crews shaking it off, vehicles pressing forward through the chaos. Soldiers knew a single Panzerfaust, a disposable tube that cost about $40, could punch through 200 millimeters of armor. The Sherman's frontal plate was 75 millimeters. A single teenager with 2 hours of training and a weapon that cost less than a pair of boots could turn a $50,000 tank and its 5-man crew into a burning coffin. That's the math that defined tank warfare by 1944. That's what the movies leave out. That's what the men inside those vehicles understood every single morning when they climbed back in. So, why did they climb in? And why did anyone design these vehicles this way in the first place? The armor was a lie, but the lie had reasons behind it, and those reasons will make you even more uncomfortable than the math. Here's the thing most people never consider. The M10's vulnerabilities weren't mistakes. They weren't oversights or budget cuts or someone forgetting to add more steel. They were features, deliberate design choices, implemented exactly as intended. The vehicle was doctrine made physical, theory cast in steel, and the theory made perfect sense for a war that never happened. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair ran Army Ground Forces. He built the entire tank destroyer branch around a specific idea. Tanks should not fight tanks. That was the core doctrine. American tanks, Shermans, would support infantry and exploit breakthroughs. When enemy armor massed for counterattack, specialized tank destroyer battalions held in reserve would intercept them. The tank destroyers would spot advancing armor from concealed positions, fire from ambush with their 3-inch guns, then displace before the enemy could respond. The motto was seek, strike, and destroy. Speed and firepower, not armor. Mobility was protection. Visibility was survival. If you did it right, you'd never take a direct hit because you'd never be caught in a direct fight. That's why the turret was open. 360, degree observation, rapid identification of threats, and near instant bailout capability when necessary. That's why the armor was thin. Every pound of steel reduced speed and mobility. That's why the hand-crank turret was considered acceptable. If you're firing from ambush at enemies who don't know you're there, you have time to traverse. The design worked beautifully. In theory, reality had other plans. The doctrinal scenario, massed German tank attacks intercepted from ambush, happened exactly once during the entire war. At El Ghetah in March 1943, tank destroyer battalions intercepted the 10th Panzer Division as intended. They destroyed 30 German tanks. They also lost 2/3 of the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion's vehicles doing it. After El Ghetah, the doctrinal scenario never materialized again. The Germans didn't mass their armor for American tank destroyers to intercept. They dispersed their tanks, used them for infantry support, employed them in hedgerow fighting where ambush tactics were impossible. So what happened to the M10 battalions? They were attached to infantry divisions as mobile artillery. They were pressed into direct fire support roles. They fired far more high-explosive shells than anti-tank ammunition. They were used in exactly the way they were never designed to survive: direct combat, close range, no ambush, no displacement. The vehicle designed to avoid direct hits was sent into situations where direct hits were inevitable. This is how institutions work. The doctrine was set. The production lines were running. The training was established. Changing course would mean admitting the theory was wrong, and institutions don't do that easily. So the M10 kept going into battle, and the crews kept dying, and everyone called them brave. Sometimes bravery is what institutions call the cost of their mistakes. Combat reports documented the problems. Commanders requested modifications. Crews improvised, welding whatever scrap steel they could find onto their vehicles, stacking sandbags on the hulls, doing anything to add protection the designers hadn't provided. None of it helped much. You can't improvise your way around the basic math. Weapons penetrating 106 millimeters, armor stopping maybe 57 if you were lucky and got hit at the right angle. The gap was too wide. Soviet testers had warned about the open turret. American crews had reported the vulnerabilities from Sicily onward. The doctrine persisted anyway. Doctrine has momentum. Admitting the theory was wrong was harder than burying the crews who proved it. Here's what makes this worse. The M10's 3-inch gun, the weapon that was supposed to justify all those compromises on armor, couldn't penetrate Panther-class frontal armor at any practical range. The vehicle designed to kill tanks from ambush couldn't kill the tanks it was supposed to be ambushing, not if they were facing you, not from the front where you were supposed to hit them before they even knew you were there. The rounds bounced off. Men watched this happen. They fired at advancing German tanks and watched their shells ricochet harmlessly. They were in vehicles designed for a war that never happened, armed with guns that couldn't do what they were designed to do, facing enemies with weapons that made their armor meaningless. And they still climbed in the next morning. That's not because they were stupid. It's not because they didn't understand. It's because the men beside them were climbing in too. And when your friends are getting into the coffin, you get in with them. The doctrine was wrong. The design was wrong for how it was used. The math was hopeless. Every crew knew it, even if they couldn't have articulated the physics. But that knowledge, that understanding of exactly how vulnerable you were, didn't make men safer. It just meant they knew exactly what they were risking when they climbed in anyway. So what did it actually look like when all this theory, all this doctrine, all these carefully designed compromises met reality? Not statistics and reports, the actual moment when men in inadequate vehicles faced enemies with weapons that couldn't be stopped. There's a specific day, a specific snowfield, a specific company reduced to 18 men, where everything the designers assumed came apart completely. The 26th of January 1945, Holtzwihr, France. The Colmar Pocket, the last German bridgehead on French soil, in the frozen Alsatian plain near the German border. Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, had started at full strength, roughly 120 enlisted men plus officers. After 2 days of fighting through the pocket, here's what remained: 18 men, 1 officer, a 19-year-old second lieutenant. All the other officers were dead. This wasn't an anomaly. This was what sustained combat did to infantry companies. By January 1945, every frontline unit in Europe was a remnant. The men at Holtzwihr weren't exceptional. They were representative. The 3rd Infantry Division had seen 531 continuous days of combat across 9 campaigns, more than any other American unit in the European theater. What happened to Company B happened everywhere, to everyone who stayed on the line long enough. The terrain was merciless. Flat, snow-covered fields, 10 to 12 inches of snow over frozen ground so hard that men couldn't dig foxholes despite hours of work with picks. The sound of picks hitting frozen granite was all you heard the night before the battle, exhausted men trying to get below ground level and failing. The only benefit, as one soldier put it, was the exercise kept them from becoming stiff and immobile in the cold. At dawn, 2 M10 tank destroyers from the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion arrived to support the position. 5 armored cars from the 3rd Reconnaissance Troop covered the right flank. That was it. That was everything Company B had to stop whatever was coming across those fields. The company commander placed his command post in a drainage ditch 10 yards in front of the rear M10. When he phoned battalion headquarters for reinforcements, the answer was simple: hold your position. The reinforcements would not be coming. At approximately 1,400 hours, the attack began forming across the open fields. 6 German tanks, roughly 250 infantry in white snow camouflage, barely visible against a white background until they started moving. One soldier remembered seeing the pennants on the German tank antennas. That got our attention right away. We also saw a huge sea of white infantry coming toward us. The M10S opened fire on the advancing tanks. Their rounds bounced off. The 3-inch gun that was supposed to destroy enemy armor couldn't penetrate Panther-class frontal armor at any practical range. Men watched the shells hit and ricochet harmlessly. One soldier later recalled, "I saw the enemy tanks get direct hits, but the rounds proved ineffective against the heavily armored German tanks. Design met reality. Design lost. The lead M10 tried to maneuver for a better firing position, maybe a side shot, maybe a different angle. It slid off the frozen road into a drainage ditch and jammed its main gun at a useless angle. The crew abandoned it. The vehicle designed for mobility, trapped and helpless. The rear M10 took a direct hit from an 88mm shell. The round pierced the thin armor and killed the commander and gunner instantly. Blood ran down the side of the hull. The surviving crew members scrambled out as the vehicle caught fire. In minutes, both tank destroyers, Company B's only heavy weapons, were finished. One stuck in a ditch, useless. The other burning, loaded with ammunition that could explode at any moment. The company commander ordered his men to fall back into the woods. The soldiers didn't want to go. They wanted to stay and fight beside their officer. But he was the one giving orders, and the order was to fall back. He stayed alone at his position. He had a field telephone connected to the artillery. He had his M1 carbine. He had 18 men depending on him and 6 tanks and 250 Germans coming across the snow. He started calling in artillery coordinates while simultaneously engaging advancing infantry with his carbine. When a nervous officer at battalion headquarters called to ask how close the Germans were, the answer came back sharp: "If you just hold the phone a minute, I'll let you talk to one of the bastards." That's soldier humor. The kind that comes when everything is falling apart and there's nothing left to do but keep talking, because if you stop talking, you might start thinking about what's actually happening. The carbine ran out of ammunition. The rear M10 was still burning. Its .50 caliber machine gun was still mounted and still functional. The vehicle was loaded with fuel and ammunition. It could explode at any moment. It was the only weapon left. He climbed aboard. Some accounts say he had to move the body of the dead commander first, whose blood had been running down the side of the hull. For approximately 1 hour, alone on top of a burning tank destroyer, he fought off 6 tanks and 250 German infantry with that .50 caliber machine gun. The billowing smoke from the fire ironically provided concealment. The Germans couldn't pinpoint exactly where the devastating fire was coming from. He focused on the infantry, reasoning that tanks wouldn't advance very far without foot soldiers to support them. He was right. As he cut down the infantry, the German tanks, unable to advance without supporting troops, fell back toward the tree line. Germans reached as close as 10 yards from his position. He killed them. They kept coming. He kept firing. He was hit by shrapnel in the leg. He ignored it. Later, trying to describe what was happening in his mind during that hour, he wrote with a flatness that reveals more than drama ever could. "My numbed brain is intent only on destroying. I am conscious only that the smoke and the turret afford a good screen, and that for the first time in 3 days, my feet are warm." That's not a punchline. That's how the mind processes standing on a burning vehicle surrounded by men trying to kill you. For 3 days, he'd been so cold he couldn't feel his feet. Now he was warm. The fire that could kill him at any second was also the first warmth he'd felt in days. You laugh because the alternative is screaming. When the ammunition was exhausted, he climbed down from the burning M10 and limped back to his company in the woods. Shortly after, the tank destroyer exploded, the turret blown skyward. He refused medical attention. He reorganized his remnant company. He led a counterattack that recaptured their original positions. He had killed or wounded approximately 50 Germans personally. The artillery he directed killed many more. When asked afterward why he did it, climbing onto that burning vehicle, staying there for an hour while it could explode at any moment, his answer was 3 words. They were killing my friends. Not patriotism, not duty, not courage in any abstract sense. The men he'd fought beside were being killed. The equipment that was supposed to protect them had failed. There was one weapon left, and his friends were dying. That's what actually motivates soldiers when everything else falls apart, loyalty to the men beside you. It's what gets men into inadequate vehicles every morning, and it's what makes them do impossible things when those vehicles fail. But here's the thing. Holtzfear wasn't unique. What happened there? Armor that couldn't stop enemy weapons, equipment failing catastrophically, men improvising desperately because everything designed to help them hadn't. That was tank warfare by 1944. Not occasionally, not as an exception, routinely. The question isn't why one man did something extraordinary on one afternoon. The question is what weapons had made the situation so impossible in the first place. The movies show tank warfare like a duel, steel against steel, armor-absorbing hits, the best tank winning. The reality was something else entirely. By 1944, the contest between armor and anti-armor weapons was over. The weapons had won, and everyone knew it. Let me tell you about the weapons that made armor a lie. Start with the 88mm gun. Originally designed for anti-aircraft use, the Germans discovered it was devastatingly effective against tanks. They mounted it on the Tiger tank. They converted flak guns for ground use. They deployed it everywhere. The Tiger I's 88mm gun could penetrate 138 millimeters of armor at 100 meters. At 2,000 meters, well over a mile, it could still punch through 100 millimeters. The Sherman's frontal armor was 75 millimeters. The M10's was 57 millimeters. What that meant in practice, a Tiger could kill any Allied tank from ranges where the Allied tank crews couldn't even identify what was shooting at them. They'd see the muzzle flash. By then, they were already dead, or about to be. The 88 created what tankers called zero-angle engagement. You were visible, you were killable, and you were helpless to respond because the enemy was beyond the effective range of your own weapons. That's terrifying enough. But the 88S weren't what really changed the math. The weapon that truly made armor obsolete was simpler, cheaper, and in far more hands. The Panzerfaust. It was a tube, a shaped charge, a trigger. Training time measured in hours. A single afternoon was enough. Cost measured in pocket change. Roughly $40 per unit. Less than a pair of decent boots. And it could penetrate 200 millimeters of armor. Think about what that means. The Sherman's frontal armor was 75 millimeters. The Panzerfaust could defeat it by nearly 3 times over. There was no Allied tank that could stop a Panzerfaust hit. None. Not the Sherman, not the British Churchill, not even the heavy tanks that barely made it to Europe before the war ended. The Panzerfaust's penetration exceeded the frontal armor of every tank fielded by any nation during the entire war. Germany produced them at a rate of 200,000 per month. By late 1944, they were everywhere. In the hands of regular Wehrmacht soldiers, in the hands of elderly Volkssturm militiamen, in the hands of Hitler Youth teenagers. Every window in every village became a potential firing position, every hedgerow, every rubble pile, every basement. A single teenager with a tube that cost less than a pair of boots could destroy a $50,000 tank and kill its entire crew. That's the math that defined tank warfare by 1944. That's the math the movies never show you. The statistics tell the story of escalation. In Normandy, only 6% of British tank losses came from Panzerfaust fire. The open terrain limited the weapon's effectiveness. Its range was short, only about 30 meters for accurate fire, and there weren't many places to hide in the Norman hedgerows. By the war's final months, that number was 34%. More than 1 in 3 British tanks destroyed by a disposable infantry weapon. In the urban combat during the Battle of Berlin, 70% of Soviet tank losses came from handheld anti-tank weapons. 70%. Every window was a potential firing position. Every pile of rubble could hide a Panzerfaust team. The Soviets lost tanks by the hundreds to weapons that cost almost nothing, wielded by defenders who barely needed training. And the Panzerfaust teams didn't work alone. Groups of 3 to 5 positioned themselves 15 to 30 meters from likely tank routes. They had light machine guns with them. The Panzerfaust destroyed the tank. The machine guns killed the crew as they tried to bail out. Systematic extermination. When a Panzerfaust hit, it made a 7.5-inch entry hole. The shaped charge jet was narrow but devastatingly hot. What killed the crew wasn't usually the initial penetration, it was what happened next. The jet ignited fuel, ammunition, anything flammable. It produced massive interior spalling. Fragments of the armor's interior surface sheared off by the impact and sprayed through the crew compartment at grenade-like velocities. Even rounds that didn't penetrate could kill through spalling. The impact sheared fragments off the inside of the armor plate and turned them into shrapnel. Your own armor became a weapon against you. No amount of additional steel could have changed this. The Panzerfaust's 200 millimeters penetration exceeded what any tank could reasonably carry. Adding more armor just added more weight, slower speeds, more bridges that couldn't support you, more roads that crumbled under your treads. It didn't add survival. The arms race was over before American tanks even landed in Normandy. Armor had lost. Every tank crew knew this. Maybe not in precise numbers, but in the way soldiers know things, through stories from other units, through watching what happened to the vehicles around them, through the simple observation that tanks kept burning and men kept dying despite all that steel. You climbed into a Sherman knowing a teenager with a cheap tube could kill you. You drove into a village knowing every window might be the last thing you saw. You advanced toward enemy positions knowing the 88S could reach you from ranges where you couldn't even see them. And you did it anyway, because the men beside you were doing it. But understanding the weapons only raises a harder question. When those weapons found their target, when the Panzerfaust hit, when the 88 round penetrated, what actually happened inside the tank? What did armor failure actually mean for the men inside? The answer is something movies can't show, and survivors struggle to describe. Here's what movies can't show you about tank warfare. What happens inside when the armor fails? The reality was fire and fragmentation and a race against the clock measured in seconds, not minutes, in a space designed to become your coffin. When an armor-piercing round penetrated a tank, the effects were catastrophic within that confined steel box. The round itself, or the fragments it created, didn't just punch through and stop. They ricocheted off the interior walls, off equipment, off anything they hit, bouncing around the crew compartment, shredding everything in their path. That includes the crew. Even rounds that didn't fully penetrate could kill everyone inside through spalling. The impact of a shell hitting the exterior armor sent shock waves through the steel. Those shock waves sheared fragments off the interior surface of the armor plate, your own protection becoming shrapnel, and sprayed them through the crew compartment at grenade-like velocities. Think about that. You're inside a steel box, trusting that steel to protect you. A round hits the outside. The steel holds. The round doesn't penetrate, and fragments of the inside of your own armor kill you anyway. If stored ammunition ignited, and it often did, the interior became a furnace within seconds. Not a slow build, not time to react, seconds. The propellant in tank shells burns at thousands of degrees. Once it started, the inside of the tank became unsurvivable almost instantly. British studies documented the grim math. Crew casualties averaged 1.28 per tank when the vehicle burned versus 0.78 per tank when it did not. That's the number that mattered most to survival. Not whether you were hit, but whether the fire started afterward. Among Sherman crews, there was an informal understanding, the kind of knowledge that gets passed from veteran crews to replacements, never written down, never official. If you could bail out within 30 seconds, you had a chance. After 30 seconds, fire would block escape routes, or ammunition would cook off, or the heat would become unsurvivable. 30 seconds. The Sherman's design actually helped with this. It had a hatch for nearly every crew member, spring-loaded for a quick opening. It had a belly escape hatch under the assistant driver's position. Soviet tanker Dmitry Loza, who commanded Lend-Lease Shermans, specifically praised these escape features as a major advantage over the T-34. The Americans had thought about getting out. They'd designed for it. But 30 seconds in a burning steel box with wounded crewmates, with hatches that might be jammed by damage, with fire spreading and ammunition waiting to explode, 30 seconds is longer than anyone can imagine until you're counting them. Clarence Moyer was a gunner with the 3rd Armored Division. He fought a famous duel with a Panther tank at Cologne Cathedral, one of the few tank versus tank engagements caught on film. He survived the war, and here's how he describes what it was like inside. He called his Sherman a 3-3-ton sardine can. He slept inside his tank, in his sleeping bag, with his boots on. Not for comfort, because the seconds saved not putting on boots might be the seconds that let him escape a hit. Every night he prepared for his own death. Every night he positioned himself so that if the moment came, if the armor failed, if the fire started, he'd have those precious few extra seconds. That's not paranoia. That's the calculation survival required. A British tank radio operator described his entire war in a single image, a letterbox-sized slit. That's all he saw. Years later, his son offered to drive him through his wartime route. Normandy, Holland, Germany, all the places he'd fought. The veteran said he wouldn't recognize any of it. He'd only ever seen it through that narrow slit, always looking straight ahead. Living inside a tank, he said, was somewhat like living inside a bomb. That's not metaphor. That's description. The overall numbers challenge the death trap narrative that some histories have promoted. Approximately 75 to 82% of Sherman crew members survived when their tank was knocked out. About 1 crewman killed per destroyed vehicle, on average. Total U.S. armored force killed in action for the entire war was approximately 1,581, a remarkably low figure given thousands of tanks destroyed. But statistics meant nothing to the man inside the steel box. Statistics can't capture watching the vehicle ahead of you take a hit and knowing you might be next. Statistics don't hear the sounds from inside a tank where the crew didn't make it out in 30 seconds. And those sounds are what veterans describe remembering decades later, trying not to hear again. An anonymous American tanker left one of the war's most bitter assessments. Lack of a principal gun with sufficient penetrating ability to knock out the German opponent has cost us more tanks, and skilled men to man more tanks than any failure of our crews. Not to mention the heartbreak and sense of defeat I and other men have felt when we see 25 or even many more of our rounds fired, and they ricochet off the enemy attackers. To be finally hit once, and we climb from and leave a burning, blackened, and now useless pile of scrap iron. 25 rounds or more, bouncing off. Then 1 hit coming back, and everything changes. That's the reality the statistics don't capture. The accumulating helplessness, the knowledge that your weapons can't hurt them, but their weapons can kill you. The wait for the hit that ends everything. And still, men climbed into those steel boxes every morning. The armor couldn't stop the weapons. The interior became a death trap when the armor failed. The men who crewed these vehicles understood all of this, maybe not in precise technical terms, but in the way soldiers understand things, in the ways that make you sleep with your boots on. So here's the question that Part 3 raises and that the next section must answer. If American commanders knew all this, and they did, they had reports and statistics and the accumulating evidence of burned-out vehicles, why didn't they build better tanks? Why didn't they add more armor, bigger guns, better protection? The answer isn't ignorance. It's not that nobody knew. The answer is worse than ignorance. The answer is calculation. You want to be angry at someone. I understand that. After everything you've learned, the thin armor, the weapons that defeated it, what happened inside when those weapons found their target, you want someone to blame. Some general who didn't care, some bureaucrat who cut corners, someone who made a terrible mistake that cost good men their lives. Here's the uncomfortable truth. It wasn't a mistake. It was a calculation. The vulnerability of American armor was deliberate policy, not ignorance, not incompetence, policy. And the men who made that policy could do the math as well as anyone. Let me show you the numbers they were working with. The M4 Sherman weighed 33 tons. The German Panther weighed 45 tons. The Tiger weighed 57 tons. That difference, those extra tons of armor and gun that made German tanks so fearsome, created problems the movies never show you. Bridges. European bridges weren't built for 5-7-ton vehicles. A Tiger couldn't cross most of them. A Panther was marginal. A Sherman could cross almost all of them. When you're trying to advance across a continent full of rivers and canals, the bridges you can cross determine how fast you move, where you can go, which routes are open to you. Roads. Heavy vehicles destroy roads. The supply lines that fed the advancing armies ran on roads that had to support not just tanks, but trucks carrying ammunition, fuel, food, replacements. Put too many heavy vehicles on a road, and the road crumbles. Put too many heavy vehicles on soft ground, and they bog down. Ships. Here's the number that mattered most. America was fighting a war across 3,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean. Every tank that reached Europe had to be shipped from American factories. The transport ships could carry a certain tonnage, 2 Shermans or 1 Tiger, twice as many medium tanks or half as many heavy ones. The logistics equation was brutal and simple. Lighter tanks meant more tanks. More tanks meant more firepower on the battlefield, even if each individual tank was more vulnerable. The calculation accepted that some of those tanks would burn, but there would be enough tanks to win anyway. America produced 49,324 Shermans during the war, 11 factories running around the clock. Germany produced roughly 6,000 Panthers and 1,347 Tiger Is. The production numbers tell you everything about how each side calculated the equation. General Leslie McNair, who ran Army ground forces, blocked development of the T-26 heavy tank during the crucial period of 1943. He argued there was no battlefield need. I see no reason to alter our previous stand, he wrote in November 1943, that we should defeat Germany by use of the M4 series of medium tanks. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't callous. He was calculating. The logistical math favored medium tanks, and he believed, genuinely believed, that the Sherman would be adequate against German armor. The tank destroyer doctrine would handle enemy tanks. The Shermans would support infantry and exploit breakthroughs. The theory made sense. The theory was also wrong. By the time it became clear how wrong, by the time commanders in the field were sending urgent reports about armor that couldn't stop German weapons, about guns that couldn't penetrate German tanks, the calculation was set. Production lines were running. Supply chains were established. Training pipelines were full of men learning to crew Shermans. Changing course would mean admitting the theory was wrong and disrupting a system that was, in aggregate, working. General Eisenhower himself expressed shock when told the 76mm gun, the upgraded weapon that was supposed to solve the penetration problem, couldn't defeat Panthers frontally. "You mean our 76 won't knock these Panthers out?" he said. "Why, I thought it was going to be the wonder gun of the war." He knew, they all knew, eventually. But by then the system had momentum that individual knowledge couldn't stop. Only 436 Pershing heavy tanks, The T-26 that McNair had blocked reached Europe before March 1945. The war in Europe ended in May. The tank that might have changed the equation arrived too late to matter. Here's the number that made the calculation acceptable to the institution. 3 out of 4 Sherman crewmen survived when their tank was knocked out. Think about that. 75% survival rate. The dead were the 25% the equation required. The institution looked at those numbers and found them acceptable. Not good, acceptable. The cost of the logistics that moved armies across oceans. The men who died in thin-skinned Shermans weren't victims of ignorance. They were acceptable losses in an acceptable calculation. The brass did the math, and the math said their deaths were worth it for the ability to ship twice as many tanks across the Atlantic. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it explicable. And understanding the calculation is necessary to understand what the crews were actually facing, not just enemy weapons, but a system that had decided their individual survival mattered less than aggregate capability. The innovation that actually saved lives was quieter than any doctrinal debate. Wet stowage, moving ammunition from the sponson walls to the hull floor, and encasing rounds in cells filled with water and glycerine. When a round penetrated, the water absorbed some of the heat and slowed the ignition of propellant. The results were dramatic. Only 10 to 15% of wet stowage Shermans burned when penetrated, compared to 60 to 80% of dry stowage models. American wet stowage Shermans burned as little as 5 to 10% of the time. British and Canadian Shermans, without the modification, burned at over 80%. That single engineering change likely saved more tanker lives than any armor upgrade could have. The solution wasn't thicker steel. The steel couldn't stop the weapons anyway. The solution was reducing the fire that killed men when steel failed. Wet stowage got less attention than the doctrinal debates. It was a quiet fix, implemented without fanfare. But it probably saved more lives than the Pershing ever could have, because it addressed the actual cause of death, fire, rather than the theoretical problem of penetration. The generals made their calculation. The calculation worked. In the aggregate, the war was won. The tanks that could be shipped outnumbered the tanks that couldn't, and numbers won. But here's what the calculation doesn't capture, what no arithmetic can measure, what it meant to climb into one of those vehicles every morning knowing you were part of that equation, knowing the institution had decided your survival was acceptable to risk, knowing the steel around you couldn't stop the weapons arrayed against it, and nobody was going to change that because the logistics didn't allow it. The men who crewed those tanks did the same math the generals did. They just experienced it differently, not as acceptable losses on a chart, as friends who burned. What kind of courage does that take? Not the extraordinary kind that gets medals, the ordinary kind that doesn't photograph well, the kind that gets into the coffin every morning because the men beside you are getting in too. The extraordinary moment gets remembered. One man on a burning tank destroyer for an hour, holding off 6 tanks and 250 Germans with a 5.0 caliber machine gun. That's the story people tell. That's what the Medal of Honor citation describes. That's what makes it into movies and books and documentaries like this one. But here's the thing. The extraordinary moment lasted 1 hour. The ordinary courage lasted months, years, every day, for as long as you stayed on the line. Climbing into a Sherman every morning, knowing what a Panzerfaust could do, knowing the 88s were out there, invisible until they fired, lethal at ranges where you couldn't even see them, knowing 3 out of 4 survived a knockout and hoping you'd be one of the 3. That's not heroism the way movies show it. It doesn't photograph well. There's no dramatic moment, no swelling music, no clear before and after. It's just a man doing his job inside a vehicle he knows might kill him, repeatedly, for months. Clarence Smoyer, the gunner from the 3rd Armored Division, described winter combat inside his Sherman. Frost forming on the interior walls from the crew's breath, frostbite common, sleeping inside the tank because there was nowhere else, in his sleeping bag with his boots on. Why boots on? Because the seconds saved not putting on boots might be the seconds that let him escape a hit every night, preparing for the hit, every morning, climbing back in. That's not paranoia. That's the calculation survival required. And it's the ordinary courage that doesn't get medals because you can't write a citation for prepared correctly for his own death every night for 8 months. Men climbed in because the men beside them were climbing in. That's the simple truth of it. Not patriotism. Patriotism is real, but it's abstract, and abstractions crack under pressure. Not duty. Duty is what you talk about afterward, not what you feel in the moment. Loyalty to your crewmates, to the men you'd been fighting beside, who were depending on you, who would have to do your job if you weren't there. They were killing my friends. That's what explained the hour on the burning tank destroyer. But it also explains every tanker who got in every morning. The friends were still there. The friends were still climbing in. You couldn't let them do it alone. Combat courage isn't a single act. It's repeated choice. Every morning tank crews had to choose to climb back in. The fear didn't diminish with experience. Sometimes it got worse, because experience taught you exactly what you were risking. You just learned to move with the fear beside you. Fear doesn't leave. You carry it. The preparation rituals became survival habits, Smoyer's boots, the visualization of escape routes before any engagement, the constant awareness of where the hatches were, how to release them, how long it took to get through, the belly hatch check, the pre-combat routine of positioning yourself for the fastest possible bailout if the hit came. 30 seconds. That's what you had. And the rituals that seemed obsessive to anyone who hadn't been inside a hit tank, those rituals were what gave you a chance at those 30 seconds. There's a kind of courage in routine, in doing the same terrifying thing repeatedly because it needs to be done. The movies can't show this because it's not dramatic. It's just a man checking his hatch release for the 100th time, visualizing the same escape route he's visualized every day for months, positioning his gear so it won't slow him down if he has to move fast. That's what survival looked like. Small preparations against large dangers. Ordinary courage expressed in ordinary actions, repeated until they became automatic, because when the moment came, there wouldn't be time to think. And the luck awareness, the understanding that preparation only gave you a chance, not a guarantee. 3 out of 4 survived. That meant 1 out of 4 didn't. Every crew understood they might be the one. You could do everything right, check every hatch, visualize every escape route, sleep with your boots on every night, and still be the one who didn't make it out. The courage was in climbing in anyway, not believing you'd be fine. That kind of belief didn't survive contact with burning tanks, accepting you might not be fine and getting in regardless, because the men beside you were getting in and you couldn't let them go alone. When veterans say anyone would have done it, they're not being modest, they're being accurate. Anyone with that crew, facing that math, feeling that loyalty, would climb in too. The circumstances created the courage, not the other way around. The extraordinary moments came from ordinary men in situations that demanded more than anyone should have to give. The real heroes didn't come back. That's the phrase that gets repeated, and it's true as far as it goes. The men who died can't tell their stories, can't deflect the praise, can't explain that what they did was just what had to be done. But here's the thing about the ones who came back. They didn't fully return either. Something stayed behind. In those steel boxes, in the snow at Holtzwer, in every vehicle they watched burn. The ordinary courage that got them through the war didn't come free. It had a cost that extended far beyond the battlefield. And that cost is what we need to talk about next. The war ended in 1945. The nightmares didn't. You can walk away from a battlefield. You can't walk away from what happened there. The men who crewed tanks and tank destroyers came home carrying everything they'd seen, everything they'd done, everything they'd survived. The interior of vehicles after penetration. The sounds of men who didn't escape in time. The knowledge of what fire does inside a steel box. That knowledge doesn't expire. It doesn't fade with the years. It just becomes something you carry, always, whether you're awake or asleep. Murphy, the man who stood on the burning M10 for an hour, slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow for the rest of his life. 26 years after the war ended, he still slept with that pistol. He converted his garage into a bedroom where he slept alone with the lights on, because darkness brought the dreams, and company meant someone might see what the dreams did to him. He held his first wife at gunpoint during flashback episodes, screaming in terror at memories that felt more real than the room around him. He broke down during the filming of war scenes in his Hollywood movies because the pyrotechnics triggered memories that 20 years of civilian life couldn't erase. No soldier ever really survives a war. He said that near the end of his life, and he wasn't speaking metaphorically. Part of you stays in the war. Part of you never comes back. Tank combat produced specific psychological wounds. Not just the general trauma of combat, though that was real enough, but particular injuries related to what it meant to live inside armor. The claustrophobia of the enclosed space, the hypervigilance around anything that felt like confinement, the specific triggers related to fire, to engine sounds, to the smell of diesel fuel and gun lubricant. The steel box followed men home in ways infantry combat didn't. An infantryman could walk away from a position. A tanker had lived inside his position, eaten there, slept there, fought there, watched friends die there. The vehicle wasn't just equipment. It was environment. And the trauma of what happened inside that environment was woven into every sensory memory associated with it. Smoyer kept his boots on while sleeping long after the war ended. The survival habit that made sense in combat didn't simply stop because the combat stopped. The mind that learned steel boxes could become coffins at any moment didn't unlearn that lesson just because the steel boxes were now in museums. The sounds were worst. Veterans describe sounds they've spent decades trying not to hear again. Not the sounds of their own vehicles, their own close calls, the sounds from other tanks. The sounds of men who didn't make it out in 30 seconds. Fire makes sounds inside a tank. So do men who can't escape the fire. Those sounds carry further than images. You can close your eyes. You can't close your ears. After the war, they took army dogs and rehabilitated them for civilian life. But they turned soldiers into civilians immediately and let them sink or swim. That's Murphy's assessment, and it applies to tank crews specifically. Men who'd lived inside steel boxes that could become coffins, who'd watched friends burn, who'd prepared every night for the hit that might kill them. They came home to parades and then to nightmares, celebrated for surviving, then left alone with what survival had cost them. The gap between public recognition and private weight defined veterans' experience. The parade was one day. The nightmares were every night. Civilians celebrated victory without understanding what victory had cost the men who achieved it. They saw heroes. They didn't see men who couldn't sleep with the lights off, or who flinched at engine sounds, or who couldn't explain why enclosed spaces made their hearts race. The gap between what civilians believed and what soldiers knew didn't close with victory. It widened. How do you explain to someone who thinks armor meant protection that armor meant target? How do you describe the 30-second window to someone who's never had to calculate whether they'd survive a fire? How do you talk about what happens inside a hit tank to people who've only seen movies where the crews shake it off and keep fighting? You don't. You can't. So you carry it alone, and you hope the people around you are patient with what they can't understand. Murphy became one of the first public figures to speak openly about what we now call PTSD. Back then they called it battle fatigue or combat neurosis, terms that made it sound temporary, manageable, something that would fade if you just gave it time. It didn't fade. Murphy knew it didn't fade. He called on the government to give increased consideration to the emotional impact of combat, to extend health care benefits to veterans struggling with wounds that didn't show on the body. He broke the silence that veterans were expected to maintain, admitted publicly that the most decorated soldier of the war couldn't sleep without a loaded pistol and couldn't stop the dreams. That took a different kind of courage than standing on the burning tank destroyer. It meant admitting weakness in a culture that expected strength. It meant being honest about damage in a society that wanted victory without cost. The Audie Murphy Memorial VA Hospital in San Antonio was dedicated 2 years after his death. The name honors his advocacy as much as his combat record. The man who won every combat medal his country could bestow spent his post-war years fighting a different battle for recognition that the real cost of war is paid long after the shooting stops. No soldier ever really survives a war. The dead are mourned and memorialized, but the living carry weights we can't see. The steel box doesn't disappear when you leave it. It just becomes internal, invisible, and permanent. What do we owe men who carried this weight? Not just gratitude. Veterans often find gratitude uncomfortable, another gap between what civilians think they should feel and what they actually experience. Something more, something harder, maybe just truth, maybe seeing clearly what they actually lived through is the tribute that matters most. Every movie that shows armor as protection erases something real. Every video game that lets players respawn in a fresh tank eliminates the weight of what actually happened inside those vehicles. Every documentary that focuses on victory without cost dishonors the men who paid that cost, not by praising them less, but by understanding them less. The romanticization of armored warfare does violence to the memory of the men who lived it. Not intentional violence, but violence nonetheless. When we simplify their experience into comfortable myth, we lose the truth they carried, and that truth is what we owe them. Here's what they actually faced. Equipment that couldn't protect them, weapons arrayed against them that their armor couldn't stop, odds that the institution had calculated and found acceptable, meaning acceptable numbers of them would die, a courage that had to be sustained not for one dramatic hour but for months of ordinary mornings, climbing into vehicles they knew might kill them. The myth says armor meant protection. The truth is armor meant target. The myth says tank crews were shielded warriors, insulated from the chaos around them. The truth is they were the highest priority targets on every battlefield, visible to everyone, vulnerable to weapons, wielded by anyone from teenagers with Panzerfausts to gunners in 88mm positions 2 kilometers away. The myth says heroism looks like movies, dramatic moments, clear choices, obvious courage. The truth is most combat courage was invisible, getting in anyway, checking the hatch release for the 100th time, sleeping with your boots on because those seconds might matter, doing the ordinary things that survival required repeatedly, without recognition, without medals, without anything except the knowledge that your crewmates were depending on you. The men who climbed into those vehicles deserved equipment that could protect them. They got equipment that made them targets. They climbed in anyway every morning because the men beside them were climbing in too. That's the truth we owe them, not sentiment, not greatest generation rhetoric that sounds nice on Memorial Day but obscures what they actually experienced. Accuracy. Seeing clearly what they faced, what their equipment actually did, what the math actually meant. The real heroes didn't come back. Murphy said that, and he meant it. The men who died in those vehicles, and the fire and the fragmentation and the 30 seconds that weren't enough, they paid everything. They can't tell their stories. They can't deflect praise. They can't explain that what they did was just what had to be done because there was nothing else left to do. But here's what Murphy knew and rarely said aloud. The ones who came back didn't fully return. Part of them stayed in those steel boxes. Part of them stayed in the snow at Holzför, in the hedgerows of Normandy, in every village where a window might hide a Panzerfaust, in every open field where an 88 might be waiting beyond visual range. The monuments honor the dead. That's right, and proper. But what about the living who carried the weight? What does remembrance look like for men who survived but never really came back? Maybe it looks like this, understanding what they actually lived through, not the movie version, not the comfortable myth. The actual experience of being inside inadequate armor, facing impossible weapons, sustained by nothing but loyalty to the men beside you. When you watch war movies now, notice the lies, the hits absorbed, the armor that holds, the crews who shake it off and fight on. That's not tribute to the men who actually crewed those vehicles. That's erasure of what they experienced. The truth was harder than that, and they deserve better than to have it softened. When you meet a veteran of any war, any branch, any vehicle, remember they may carry something you can't see. The war ended decades ago for most of them. The mine's preparation didn't end. Some part of them is still calculating escape routes, still checking hatch releases, still listening for the sounds they spend decades trying not to hear. What you owe them isn't gratitude, though gratitude is appropriate. What you owe them is understanding, not pity. They don't want pity. Understanding, seeing clearly what they lived through, what it cost them, what they still carry. That's the tribute that matters. Not the parades, not the speeches, the willingness to see the truth and sit with it, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it challenges what you thought you knew, even when it reveals that the steel didn't protect anyone, that the armor was a lie, that the courage required wasn't dramatic and photographable, but ordinary and invisible, and sustained across months of mornings when climbing into the coffin was the only option. We started with the myth, armor means protection. We end with the truth, armor meant target. The men who crewed tanks and tank destroyers understood this. They climbed in anyway. Not because they believed the steel would save them. That belief didn't survive the first time you watched a round bounce off your own gun and punch through someone else's hull. They climbed in because the men beside them were climbing in. Because the friends they'd fought beside were in those vehicles, and you couldn't let friends face that alone. They were killing my friends. 3 words that explain everything. The hour on the burning tank destroyer, and every ordinary morning that led to it. No soldier ever really survives a war. That's not sentiment. That's not poetry. That's the truth of it, spoken by a man who knew it in his bones, who slept with a loaded pistol for 26 years after the shooting stopped, who carried the steel box inside him until the day he died. The dead are mourned and memorialized. The living carry weights we can't see and often don't want to see, because seeing them would require us to understand what we asked of them. The steel box didn't protect them. It made them targets. It became their workplace, their home, sometimes their coffin. They lived inside it knowing what could happen at any moment, and they did their jobs anyway. What we owe them isn't comfortable memory. It's accurate memory. The truth finally seen is what we owed them all along. And maybe, if we see clearly enough, if we understand what they actually faced and what it actually cost, then the telling matters. Not as redemption, because there's no redemption for what war does, but as recognition, as the acknowledgement that we know what happened, we understand what it meant, we see them clearly. The steel box didn't protect them. Maybe the truth can.